The last stalk of corn cracked beneath Faith Owens' worn boots, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to lose everything her parents had died to give her. The August sun of 1883 beat down on the parched Kansas earth like a hammer on an anvil, relentless and merciless. Faith stood in what had once been 20 acres of promising crops outside Newton, watching dust devils dance across the cracked soil. 6 months without proper rain had transformed her family's farm into a graveyard of broken dreams. The wheat had withered first, then the corn, and finally even the hardy sorghum had surrendered to the drought. At 23 years old, Faith had survived losing her parents to cholera 2 years prior, had learned to run the farm alone, had weathered harsh winters and difficult harvests. But this drought was different. It was killing more than crops. It was killing her will to keep fighting. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her sun-bronzed skin. Her once bright calico dress hung loose on her frame, testimony to too many skipped meals. The well was nearly dry, producing barely enough water for her and the 3 scrawny chickens that were all that remained of her livestock. She had sold the cow last month, the pigs the month before that. The horse had gone lame and she had been forced to put him down herself, crying as she did what needed to be done. Faith turned toward the farmhouse, a modest structure her father had built with his own hands. The paint was peeling now, the porch sagging slightly. She could not afford repairs. She could barely afford to eat. The bank had sent another letter last week, threatening foreclosure if she could not make the payment by month's end. She had $12 to her name and owed $200. As she walked toward the house, she noticed a figure on horseback approaching down the long dirt road. Visitors were rare these days. Most of the neighboring farms had already been abandoned, their owners having given up and moved on to seek better fortunes elsewhere or in town. Faith shaded her eyes against the glare and watched the rider come closer. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. As he drew nearer, Faith could make out more details. He rode a sturdy chestnut mare that looked well-fed and cared for, a stark contrast to the suffering animals she had seen recently. The man himself appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong build and an easy way of sitting his horse that spoke of years in the saddle. He pulled up near her fence, what remained of it, and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, madam. Name's Pierce Coleman. I'm looking for work, and I heard in town there might be farms out this way in need of an extra hand." Faith almost laughed at the bitter irony, but the sound died in her throat. "You heard wrong, I'm afraid. As you can see, there's nothing here to work. The drought has seen to that." Pierce looked around at the devastated fields, his expression grave. He had clear gray eyes that seemed to assess everything with careful attention. His jaw was strong and shadowed with several days' growth of beard, and dust from the road coated his dark shirt and leather vest. "I can see it's been hard. Been riding through this country for 3 days now, and it's the same everywhere. Drought's got this whole region in its grip." "Then why are you looking for farm work?" Faith asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Exhaustion and despair had worn away her patience. "Any sensible person would be heading west or north, anywhere the grass is still green." "Maybe I'm not sensible," Pierce said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite humor but not quite serious either. "Or maybe I figure the people who stay and fight through the hard times are the ones worth working for." He paused, studying her face with those steady gray eyes. "When did you last have water?" "I have water," Faith said defensively. "The well still gives a little each day. Enough for drinking." "Enough for what I need." Pierce was quiet for a moment, Then he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. He was taller than Faith had realized, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of someone who made his living through physical labor. He walked to his horse and untied a large canteen from his saddle, then another, and another. Faith counted 4 canteens in total, all clearly full by the weight of them. "I've been following a creek about 5 miles north of here," Pierce said, approaching the fence. "It's still running, fed by a spring up in the hills. Water's good and cold. I filled up this morning." He held out one of the canteens to her. "You look like you could use a drink of something that doesn't taste like dust." Faith stared at the offered canteen, pride warring with desperate thirst. She had been rationing her water so carefully, allowing herself only the bare minimum. The thought of cold, clean water made her throat ache with longing. "I can't pay you for it," she said quietly. "Did I ask you to?" Pierce's voice was gentle. "It's water, madam, not gold. There's plenty more where this came from." Something in Faith's carefully maintained composure cracked. Maybe it was the kindness in his voice, or the simple generosity of the gesture, or just the accumulated weight of 6 months of struggle. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached through the broken fence to accept the canteen. She unscrewed the cap and raised it to her lips, intending to take just a small sip. But the water was so cold, so pure, so blessedly wet that she found herself drinking in long, desperate gulps. "Easy," Pierce said, not unkindly. "Don't make yourself sick." Faith lowered the canteen, water dripping down her chin. For a moment she was embarrassed by her lack of control, but then she met Pierce's eyes and saw no judgment there, only understanding. "Thank you," she managed. "I didn't realize how thirsty I was." "When you're trying to survive, you get used to ignoring what your body needs," Pierce said. "I've been there." He glanced toward the farmhouse. "You have animals. They need water too, just 3 chickens left. I've been giving them what little the well produces each morning." Without waiting for permission or invitation, Pierce picked up 2 of the remaining canteens and headed toward the farmhouse. Faith hurried after him, still clutching her canteen. "Wait, you don't have to do that. I told you I can't pay you." Pierce stopped and turned to face her. In the harsh sunlight, she could see the lines around his eyes, marks of a man who had spent years squinting against sun and wind. There was something weathered about him, but also something solid and reliable. "Miss, I don't know your situation, and it's not my business to ask. But I can see you've been fighting a hard battle out here. I have water that I can easily replace. It costs me nothing to share it. So how about you just accept the help without worrying about payment?" Faith felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself in weeks. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and led him to the small chicken coop beside the barn. The 3 hens perked up at their approach, making hopeful noises. Pierce found a shallow pan and filled it with water from his canteen. The chickens rushed to it immediately, drinking with the same desperate enthusiasm Faith had shown moments before. "Poor things," Pierce murmured, watching them. "They've been hurting too." "Everything's hurting," Faith said quietly. "The whole world is dying of thirst." Pierce straightened and looked at her with those assessing gray eyes. "Not the whole world, just this part of it, and just for now. Droughts end. Rain comes back. Life goes on." "Pretty words," Faith said, and there was bitterness in her tone despite her gratitude for the water. "But words don't pay the bank. I'm going to lose this farm in 3 weeks. My parents built this place from nothing. They died here, and I'm going to lose it because I can't make it rain." "You can't make it rain," Pierce agreed, "but there are other things you can do." He looked around at the property, his gaze sharp and analytical. "That creek I mentioned, 5 miles north. If we could run a pipeline or dig an irrigation channel, we could bring water to this land. Not enough to save what's already dead, but enough to keep you and your animals alive. Enough to plant winter wheat when the time comes. Faith shook her head. That's impossible. 5 miles of pipeline would cost a fortune, and digging a channel through this hard ground, it would take a dozen men working for months. Or 2 people working smart for 3 weeks, Pierce said. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not saying it would be easy, but I've seen it done before in Colorado. Miners used wooden sluices to bring water down from the mountains. Same principle could work here. Why would you help me do that? Faith asked. The question came out more forcefully than she intended, fueled by confusion and the fear of hoping for something that might not be real. You don't know me. You have no stake in whether I keep this farm or lose it. What possible reason could you have for working that hard for a stranger? Pierce was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the ruined fields. When he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. 3 years ago, I had a ranch in Texas. Not big, but it was mine. Built it up from nothing over 5 years of hard work. Then came a bad winter, worse than anyone had seen in decades. Lost all my cattle, lost the ranch to the bank that spring. He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. I had neighbors who could have helped, who had supplies to spare, hay to share, but they didn't. They watched me lose everything and didn't lift a finger, because that's just business. That's just the way things are. I swore if I ever saw someone else in that situation, I'd be the help I never got. Faith studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives, but she found only honest remembrance of pain. She recognized it because she carried the same pain herself. And you think you can really build something that will bring water from that creek? I know I can, Pierce said with quiet confidence. Question is, are you willing to try? It'll be hard work, harder than anything you've probably done before, and there's no guarantee the bank will wait, even if we succeed. Faith looked around at her dying farm, at the house her father had built, at the land her mother had loved. She thought about giving up, about walking away and leaving it all behind. It would be easier. It would hurt less. But somewhere in the deepest part of her heart, in the place where her spirit still flickered like a candle in the wind, she found a spark of something she had thought was dead, hope. All right, she said, meeting Pierce's eyes. All right, let's try. Over the next 3 days, Pierce proved to be a man of his word in every sense. He set up a small camp near the barn, refusing Faith's offer to sleep in the house despite her protests that it was only proper. Each morning before dawn, he would ride out to the creek and return with all 4 canteens filled with fresh water. He shared it freely, not just with Faith and the chickens, but also with the few struggling plants near the house that still clung to life. But more than the water, he shared something Faith had been missing for months: company. After 6 months of solitude broken only by occasional trips to town for supplies she could barely afford, having another person around felt strange at first. Pierce was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He told her about his travels through Colorado and Wyoming, about the different methods he had seen people use to survive in harsh conditions. He spoke about his lost ranch without self-pity, simply as a fact of his past that had shaped who he had become. In turn, Faith found herself talking about her parents, something she had not done since their deaths. She told Pierce about her father's stubborn determination to make the farm succeed, about her mother's herb garden that had once flourished near the kitchen window. She spoke about the loneliness of running the farm alone, the constant fear of failure, the weight of responsibility that sometimes felt too heavy to bear. "You've carried it well," Pierce said one evening as they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and red across the dusty horizon. A lot of people would have given up months ago. I thought about it, Faith admitted. Every single day I thought about it. There's a family in town, the Hendersons. They own the mercantile. Mrs. Henderson offered me a job as a clerk. It wouldn't pay much, but it would be steady. I could rent a room, have regular meals. She paused, picking at a loose thread on her skirt. It would be the sensible thing to do. But you're still here, Pierce observed. I'm still here. Faith looked out at the darkening fields. My father used to say that Owens women were too stubborn for their own good. I guess he was right. Pierce smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Stubborn can be a virtue in the right circumstances. Is that what it was for you? Stubbornness that kept you going after you lost your ranch, partly. Pierce leaned back against the porch post, his long legs stretched out before him. Partly it was not knowing what else to do. When you've spent years building towards something and then it's gone, you feel lost. I drifted for a while, took odd jobs, moved from place to place. Told myself I was looking for opportunity, but really I was just running from the memory of failure. What changed? Faith asked. Pierce was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes distant. I met an old rancher in Wyoming, must have been 80 if he was a day. He had lived through droughts and blizzards, through Indian wars and outlaw raids, through the death of his wife and 2 of his sons. And he was still there, still working his land, still getting up every morning with purpose. I asked him how he kept going through so much loss. You know what he told me? Faith shook her head. He said that loss is just part of the deal. When you love something, whether it's land or a person or a dream, you accept that it might hurt you, might break your heart. But the alternative is not loving anything, not trying for anything, just existing without purpose. And that's not really living at all. Pierce looked at Faith directly. He said the measure of a person isn't whether they fall down, it's whether they get back up. I'm tired of getting back up, Faith said softly. I'm so tired. I know, Pierce said, and the understanding in his voice made Faith's throat tighten with emotion. But you're still here. You're still standing. That counts for something. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the vast Kansas sky. Faith found herself acutely aware of Pierce's presence beside her, of the solid strength he represented. It had been so long since she had felt anything other than alone. Having him here, sharing her struggle, made the burden feel lighter somehow. On the 4th day, Pierce declared it was time to begin work on the water channel. He had spent the previous days surveying the land between the farm and the creek, working out the best route and calculating what materials they would need. The plan was ambitious. They would construct a series of wooden sluices using lumber from Faith's dilapidated barn, creating an elevated channel that would carry water from the creek across the 5 miles to the farm. It won't be permanent, Pierce explained as they stood in the barn, assessing the available lumber. This is about survival, about getting you through to the next planting season. When you have money coming in again, you can invest in something more substantial. Metal pipes, maybe, or a properly engineered irrigation system. But for now, we work with what we have. What they had was a barn full of aged lumber, some basic tools and determination born of desperation. They began by carefully dismantling the least essential parts of the barn structure, salvaging boards that were still sound. It was hard, physical work that left them both exhausted and covered in dust and splinters. Faith had done farm work her entire life, but this was different. This required precision and planning, measuring and cutting, fitting pieces together in a way that would hold water without leaking. Pierce proved to be an excellent teacher, showing Faith how to angle the boards to create a stable trough, how to seal the seams with pine pitch and cloth to prevent leaks. They worked from dawn until dusk, breaking only for brief meals of the simple food Faith had on hand. Cornbread made from the last of her flour, beans, occasional eggs from the chickens. As they worked side by side, Faith found herself noticing things about Pierce that went beyond gratitude for his help. The way his hands moved with confidence and skill, shaping wood into something useful. The strength in his shoulders as he lifted heavy beams. The patience in his voice when he explained something for the third time because she had not quite understood. The rare smile that lit his face when they successfully completed a section of sluice. She also noticed the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention. There was something in his gaze that made her heart beat a little faster, something that had nothing to do with drought or water or survival. By the end of the first week, they had constructed the first quarter-mile of sluice, starting from the creek and working back toward the farm. It was back-breaking work, hauling the constructed sections into place, setting up supports to keep them elevated and stable. Pierce insisted on doing the heaviest lifting, but Faith refused to be treated as fragile. She carried her share, pushed her body beyond exhaustion, driven by the growing belief that this impossible plan might actually work. On the 8th day, disaster struck. They were working on a particularly tricky section that had to span a small ravine when one of the supports gave way. The entire assembled piece, representing 2 days of work, crashed to the ground, boards splintering and breaking. Faith stood staring at the wreckage, feeling the last of her hope crumbling. "It's not going to work," she said, her voice flat with despair. "We're fooling ourselves. Even if we could finish it in time, even if we could actually get water to the farm, it's not enough. I can't pay the bank with hope and wood scraps." Pierce surveyed the damage, his expression serious but not defeated. "We can rebuild this section. We'll reinforce the supports better this time. We'll learn from the mistake." "You're not listening to me," Faith said, her voice rising. "It doesn't matter. Even if we finish this, even if water flows to my farm, I still lose everything in 2 weeks. The bank doesn't care about irrigation channels. They want money I don't have." "Then we'll figure that out too," Pierce said calmly. "How?" Faith demanded, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. "How exactly do we figure that out? Are you going to magically produce $200? Because I've tried everything, I've sold everything. There's nothing left." Pierce was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Faith, I know you're scared. I know this feels impossible. But giving up now means everything we've done this past week was for nothing. Is that really what you want?" Faith felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. All the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope of the past week came pouring out. "I don't know what I want anymore. I don't know what I'm fighting for. I'm so tired of being strong. I'm so tired of doing this alone." "You're not alone," Pierce said. And suddenly he was there, pulling her into his arms, holding her as she finally broke down and sobbed against his chest. He did not try to quiet her or tell her it would be all right. He just held her, solid and steady, letting her pour out all the pain she had been holding inside for so long. When the storm of tears finally subsided, Faith found herself still wrapped in Pierce's embrace, her face buried against his shirt. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and regular. She could smell sweat and sawdust and something else, something distinctly him that she could not name but found comforting. "I'm sorry," she mumbled against his chest. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "Nothing to be sorry for," Pierce said quietly. His hand moved gently through her hair, a gesture of comfort that felt both innocent and intimate. "You've been holding the world on your shoulders for months. Everyone breaks sometimes. Doesn't make you weak, makes you human." Faith pulled back slightly to look up at him. His gray eyes were soft with concern and something else, something that made her breath catch. They were standing so close, his arms still around her. She could see every detail of his face, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the stubble on his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as he looked down at her. "Pierce," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, knowing only that something had shifted between them in that moment of vulnerability and comfort. He seemed to understand without words. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the remnants of her tears. "Faith," he said, and her name in his low voice sent a shiver through her. "I need you to know something. When I offered to help you, it was because it was the right thing to do, but somewhere along the way it became more than that." "More," Faith whispered. "More," Pierce confirmed. "These past days, working beside you, seeing your strength and your determination, getting to know who you are beyond the struggle, I have found myself feeling things I did not expect to feel." He paused, searching her face. "I don't want to take advantage of your vulnerability. If I'm reading this wrong, if these feelings are only on my side, just tell me and we'll go back to working together. Nothing more." Faith's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could feel it. What if the feelings aren't only on your side? Something blazed in Pierce's eyes, hope and desire and tenderness all mixed together. "Then I'd like very much to kiss you if you'd allow it." In answer, Faith rose on her toes and closed the small distance between them. When their lips met, it felt like rain after drought, like water in the desert, like something essential and life-giving that she had not known she had been dying without. Pierce kissed her with a gentleness that made her ache, as if she were something precious and fragile that he feared breaking. But when she pressed closer, her hands gripping his shirt, the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and needful. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to save your farm," he said firmly. "I don't know how yet, but we will. And then, if you're willing, I'd like to stay. Not as hired help or a drifter passing through, but as someone who is here because this is where he wants to be, because you're here." Faith felt something bloom in her chest, warm and bright and terrifying in its intensity. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." They rebuilt the collapsed section stronger than before, working with renewed energy born of shared purpose and growing affection. Each day brought them closer, not just to completing the water channel but to each other. They learned to work together with the easy coordination of a practiced team, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other's weaknesses. In the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together and talk for hours. Pierce told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the mother who had died when he was young, and the father who had raised him to be honest and hardworking. Faith shared stories about growing up on the farm, about the good years before the drought when the land had been generous and life had seemed full of promise. And sometimes they did not talk at all. Sometimes they would simply sit close together, holding hands, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Sometimes Pierce would steal kisses that grew increasingly heated until they had to pull apart, knowing that there were lines they should not cross. Not yet. Not when everything was still so uncertain. On the 14th day, with only 1 week remaining until the bank's deadline, they completed the water channel. 5 miles of wooden sluice stretched from the creek to Faith's farm, elevated on supports they had built and reinforced. They stood at the creek, both nervous and excited, as Pierce opened the makeshift gate they had constructed. Water rushed into the channel with a sound like music. They ran alongside it, watching it flow, checking for leaks, making quick repairs where needed. The water moved swiftly down the gentle gradient they had calculated, rushing toward the farm. When it finally poured into the holding tank they had constructed near the barn, Faith let out a cry of pure joy. She turned to Pierce, her face alight with triumph and disbelief. "We did it. We actually did it." Pierce grabbed her around the waist and spun her in a circle, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her soundly. "You did it. You didn't give up. You kept fighting." "We did it together," Faith corrected. She looked at the water flowing into the tank, clear and cold and abundant. It was enough to drink, enough for the animals, enough to irrigate a garden, enough to sustain life. "But you were right. It's not enough to save the farm from the bank." The joy faded from Pierce's expression. "I've been thinking about that. There might be a way, but you're not going to like it." "Tell me," Faith said. "The cattle drive," Pierce began. "There's one coming through Newton in 3 days, heading north to the railhead. They always need extra drovers for the last leg of the journey. The pay is good, $60 for 2 weeks of work. If I sign on, and if you could manage something here in town, maybe taking that job at the mercantile for a couple weeks, we could combine what we earn." Faith was already shaking her head. "That's maybe $100 between us, and that's if everything goes perfectly. I need 200. "I know," Pierce said. "That's why I'd also sell my horse and saddle. The mare alone should bring at least $80, maybe $100 to the right buyer. My saddle and tack, another 20. "It's enough. It would be enough." Faith stared at him in shock. "Your horse. Pierce, she's all you have. She's your livelihood. You can't sell her for my farm." "I can and I will," Pierce said firmly. "A horse can be replaced. Your family's legacy, your home, that can't. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I figure once we save the farm, I'll be staying on. Won't need a horse for drifting if I'm not drifting anymore." "You do that for me?" Faith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Give up everything for a farm that might still fail, for a woman you've known 2 weeks. Pierce took both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her heart race. "Faith, in 2 weeks you've become more important to me than anything I've owned in my entire life. This isn't about the farm. It's about you. It's about us. It's about building something that matters with someone who matters. So yes, I'll sell my horse. I'll do whatever it takes." Faith felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different from the tears of despair she had shed before. These were tears of overwhelming emotion, of gratitude and love and hope reborn. "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could think about whether it was too soon, too fast. "Is that crazy? To love someone after 2 weeks? If it is, we're both crazy," Pierce said, pulling her close. "Because I love you too. Probably have since the day you drank that water like you'd never tasted anything so good in your life." They held each other beside the flowing water, both of them dusty and exhausted and desperately in love. The sun beat down on them, merciless as ever, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like just another challenge they would face together. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Pierce rode into Newton and negotiated with the trail boss of the cattle drive, securing a position as a drover. Faith swallowed her pride and went to Mrs. Henderson at the mercantile, accepting the offer of temporary employment. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman in her 50s, agreed to pay her weekly, understanding the urgency of Faith's situation. The hardest part was selling Pierce's horse. They found a buyer, a rancher from Texas who recognized good horseflesh when he saw it. He offered $90, a fair price. Faith stood beside Pierce as he said goodbye to the mare, watching him stroke her neck and whisper words she could not hear. She knew what the horse meant to him, represented to him, and she knew what it cost him to let her go. When the rancher led the mare away, Pierce stood silent for a long moment. Faith slipped her hand into his. "We'll get you another horse," she promised. "A good one when we have the money." "I know," Pierce said quietly. "It's just hard letting go of the last piece of my old life." Maybe that's not a bad thing, Faith offered. Maybe it means you're free to build a new life, a better one. Pierce looked down at her, his expression softening. With you, with me, Faith confirmed. Pierce left with the cattle drive the next morning, kissing Faith goodbye before dawn. 2 weeks, he promised. I'll be back in 2 weeks with the money. You hold on until then. I will, Faith promised. Be safe. Watching him ride away on a borrowed horse was harder than Faith had expected. After working side by side for 2 weeks, his absence felt like a physical ache. But she had work to do. The water channel needed daily maintenance to keep it flowing. The chickens needed tending. And she had her shifts at the mercantile, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. Mrs. Henderson proved to be an excellent employer, patient with Faith's inexperience and sympathetic to her situation. The work was not physically demanding like farm work, but it required patience and attention to detail, taking inventory, helping customers, keeping the books organized. Faith found she did not hate it, though she missed the open sky and the feeling of working with the land. On her first Sunday off, Faith used her meager wages to buy a small bag of chicken feed and a pound of coffee, luxuries she had gone without for months. She spent the day at the farm, checking the water channel, cleaning the chicken coop, sitting on the porch and imagining Pierce beside her. The loneliness was intense, but underneath, it ran a current of hope that sustained her. The second week dragged by with agonizing slowness. Faith worked her shifts, counted every dollar she earned, and waited for news of the cattle drive. On the 12th day, a telegram arrived at the mercantile. Mrs. Henderson brought it to Faith with a concerned expression. Faith's hands shook as she opened it. The message was brief. Drive delayed by storm. Extra 3 days. Don't worry. Coming soon. P. 3 extra days meant the bank's deadline would pass before Pierce returned. Faith felt panic rising in her chest, but she forced it down. She had not come this far to give up now. She went to the bank that afternoon and requested a meeting with Mr. Thornton, the bank manager. Mr. Thornton was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of perpetual disapproval. He listened to Faith's explanation with obvious skepticism. Miss Owens, the bank has already extended your deadline once. We cannot continue to make exceptions. I'm not asking for an exception, Faith said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I'm asking for 3 days. I have most of the money. The rest will be here within the week. Surely 3 days is not unreasonable. The bank has obligations to its investors, Mr. Thornton said. We cannot be seen as soft on delinquent accounts. I have never been delinquent until this drought, Faith argued. My father banked with you for 15 years and never missed a payment. I'm asking you to honor that history with 3 days of grace. Mr. Thornton was unmoved. I'm sorry, Miss Owens. The deadline stands. If payment is not received in full by Friday, the property will be foreclosed and put up for auction. Faith left the bank feeling numb. She had been so close. So impossibly close. She worked her shift at the mercantile in a daze, barely able to focus on the customers. When Mrs. Henderson asked if she was all right, Faith explained the situation. Mrs. Henderson listened thoughtfully, then said, "How much are you short?" "About $40, Faith admitted. I'll have the rest when Pierce returns, but that will be too late." "I'll lend it to you," Mrs. Henderson said immediately. Faith stared at her in shock. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, I'm offering." The older woman smiled warmly. "You're a hard worker, Faith. More importantly, you're a good person in a difficult situation. I can spare $40 and I trust you'll pay me back when you're able." Faith felt tears threatening again. The kindness of near strangers, first Pierce and now Mrs. Henderson, was almost more than she could bear. "I will pay you back, every penny, I promise." "I know you will," Mrs. Henderson said. "Now let's get you to that bank before Mr. Thornton leaves for the day." Faith walked into the bank with Mrs. Henderson beside her, carrying every dollar she had earned plus the 40 Mrs. Henderson had pressed into her hand. She counted it out on Mr. Thornton's desk, her hands steady despite her racing heart. $160. The money she had saved from selling her livestock weeks ago brought it to 180. The wages from her mercantile work made it 195. Mrs. Henderson's loan completed it, $200 exactly. Mr. Thornton counted the money twice, his expression sour, as if he was disappointed not to be able to foreclose. Finally, he stamped her payment receipt and handed it to her. "Your account is current, Miss Owens. See that it stays that way." Faith clutched the receipt like it was the most precious thing in the world. Outside the bank, she turned to Mrs. Henderson and hugged her impulsively. Thank you so much." "You're welcome, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, patting her back. "Now, I believe you have a farm to take care of and a young man to wait for." Pierce returned 4 days later, exhausted and covered in trail dust, but with $60 in his pocket. Faith met him on the road to the farm, having watched for him every evening. When she saw him riding toward her on the borrowed horse, she ran to meet him. Pierce dismounted quickly, catching her as she threw herself into his arms. "You're back. You're really back." "I'm back," he confirmed, holding her tight. "I'm sorry it took so long. The storm scattered the herd and we lost 3 days gathering them again. Did you make the payment? Please tell me I'm not too late." "You're not too late," Faith said, pulling back to smile at him through happy tears. "I made the payment. Mrs. Henderson loaned me the difference. The farm is safe." Pierce let out a breath of pure relief. "Thank God. I was so worried, Faith. Every day we were delayed, I kept thinking about you facing the bank alone." "I wasn't alone," Faith said. "I had people who believed in me. I had you even when you weren't here. I had hope." Pierce cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "I love you so much. These past 2 weeks without you were the longest of my life." "Then don't leave again," Faith said. "Stay, make this your home, make me your home." "Is that a proposal, Miss Owens?" Pierce asked, a smile playing at his lips. "Maybe it is, Mr. Coleman," Faith said, feeling bold and happy and more alive than she had in months. "What do you say?" "I say yes," Pierce said and kissed her deeply. "Yes to staying. Yes to making this home. Yes to you, always you." They were married a month later in Newton's small church, with Mrs. Henderson and her husband as witnesses. Faith wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Pierce wore his best shirt and a new vest he had purchased with his droving wages. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Faith felt a completeness she had never known before. The first year of their marriage was not easy. The drought continued for another 3 months before the rains finally came, torrential storms that turned the parched earth to mud. But the water channel Pierce had built meant they had survived the worst of it, and when planting season came, they had water to irrigate their crops. Pierce proved to be as skilled at farming as he was at building. Together, they planted winter wheat and sorghum, worked the land from dawn to dusk, rebuilt the farm 1 day at a time. The chickens multiplied, and they saved enough to buy a milk cow and 2 pigs. Pierce bought a new horse, not as fine as his mare had been, but steady and reliable. Faith repaid Mrs. Henderson's loan within 6 months, and the older woman celebrated by giving them a set of fine china as a wedding gift. The farm began to produce again, not abundantly, but enough. Enough to pay the bank, enough to live on, enough to build a future. 2 years after they married, Faith discovered she was pregnant. She told Pierce one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over fields that were green and growing. He responded by sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We're going to have a baby." Their son was born in the spring of 1886, a healthy boy with Pierce's gray eyes and Faith's stubborn determination. They named him Thomas, after Faith's father. Holding her son in her arms with Pierce beside her looking at them both with such love and wonder, Faith thought about how close she had come to losing everything, how the drought had nearly broken her, how she had been ready to give up. And she thought about a cowboy who had ridden up to her dying farm and offered her water, water that became hope, hope that became love, love that became this, a family, a home, a life rebuilt from dust and determination. The drought years became a memory, a story they would tell Thomas when he was older, about how his parents had met and fought together to save the farm. The wooden water channel eventually fell into disrepair, replaced by a proper irrigation system when they had the money. But Pierce kept a section of it in the barn as a reminder of what they had accomplished together. Faith never forgot the lessons those hard times had taught her. She never took water for granted, never wasted a drop. She and Pierce always helped their neighbors when times were tough, remembering how kindness from strangers had saved them when they needed it most. As the years passed, the farm prospered. They added more land, more animals, more children. A daughter arrived 2 years after Thomas, then another son 3 years after that. The house was expanded, repaired, painted. The barn was rebuilt. The fields produced good harvests year after year. But the heart of everything, the foundation it was all built on, was the love between Faith and Pierce. They worked side by side every day, partners in every sense of the word. They argued sometimes, as all couples do, but they never forgot what they had survived together, how they had pulled each other through the darkest times. On their 10th anniversary, Pierce surprised Faith with a gift. He led her out to the pasture where a beautiful chestnut mare stood waiting, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. She looked remarkably like the mare he had sold all those years ago. "Pierce," Faith breathed, "she's beautiful, but we can't afford this." "Actually, we can," Pierce said with a smile. "Farm's doing well. Bills are paid, kids are fed. We've got money in the bank for the first time in years, and I wanted us to have her, so we can ride together." Faith threw her arms around him, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Pierce said. "Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter who showed up on your doorstep with nothing but water and hope." "Thank you for seeing me at my lowest and choosing to stay," Faith replied. They stood together in the pasture, holding each other, the mare grazing peacefully beside them. In the distance, they could hear their children playing, their laughter carried on the wind. The sky above was clear and blue, and the land around them was green and thriving. Faith thought about that day 10 years ago, when she had stood in her dying fields and thought she was going to lose everything. She had lost things in the end, lost the last remnants of her old life, lost the illusion that she could survive alone, lost her fear of trusting someone else. But she had gained so much more: a husband who loved her, children who filled her days with joy, a farm that flourished, a future that stretched before her, bright with possibility. The drought had killed her crops and nearly her spirit. But a cowboy had shared his water and his hope, and in doing so had given her everything that truly mattered. Not just survival but life, not just endurance but love, not just existence but purpose. Years later, when Thomas was grown with children of his own, he would ask his mother about those times. Faith would tell him the whole story, not hiding the hardship or the fear, but emphasizing the hope and the love that had sustained them. "Your father saved me," she would say. And Pierce, sitting beside her, would shake his head. "We saved each other." And that was the truth of it. In the harsh landscape of the Kansas drought, two people had found each other at exactly the right moment. They had fought together, worked together, built something beautiful together from nothing but determination and love. The farm that Faith had nearly lost became a legacy passed down through generations. Thomas took it over when Pierce and Faith grew too old to work the land, and his children after him. But the real legacy was not the land itself. It was the story of two people who refused to give up, who chose hope over despair, who found love in the hardest of times. Faith lived to be 83, Pierce to 86. They spent their final years sitting on that same porch where they had first kissed, holding hands and watching their grandchildren play in the fields. When Faith passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, Pierce followed her just 3 months later, as if he could not bear to be parted from her for long. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery outside Newton, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and a single inscription. Together they built hope from dust. And in the years that followed, whenever the rains were scarce and times grew hard, the family would remember Faith and Pierce. They would remember that drought's end, that persistence matters, that love sustains. They would remember that sometimes salvation comes in unexpected forms, riding up on horseback with water and hope. The story became part of the family mythology, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But at its core, it remained what it had always been: a simple, powerful truth about the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. Two people, facing impossible odds, who chose to fight together rather than surrender separately. Two people who saved each other in every way that mattered, and somewhere in the Kansas earth, in the land that Faith and Pierce had loved and worked and saved, their legacy continued. Crops grew, water flowed, life persisted. And love, like the spring that had fed Pierce's Creek, continued to flow endlessly, nourishing everything it touched, sustaining future generations with the power of their example. The drought had tried to break them. Instead, it had forged them into something stronger, something lasting, something beautiful. It had brought them together when they needed each other most. And from that meeting had grown not just survival, but a lifetime of joy, a family that thrived, a love that endured beyond death itself. That was the true victory. Not just that they had saved the farm, though they had. Not just that they had survived the drought, though they had done that too. The true victory was that in the midst of hardship and despair, they had found something worth fighting for: each other. And that had made all the difference.